Thought about doing something cute here, you know. Oh my god, AWE in progress. But that takes time, which is something I have so little of. But I was literally just thinking about interacting with my friends and family less in order to have more time to get projects done, so no. However, what I do have time for is to tell you something. I cannot, in any real functional way, talk about this game without spoiling it, so, as usual, spoiler warning. Some people may or may not be aware of this, but I like to approach these ruminations with a pretty structured style overall. I try to talk about the behind the scenes as relevant, usually at the beginning. Then I try to talk about gameplay, and then I try to talk about narrative. The thing is, I don't want to say... You ever heard someone say, man, I like the story in Game X, but the gameplay sucks, right? One of the things I've come more accustomed to the older I get is that those statements, while generically true, don't really convey the full sense of the information. Because this game did score a net positive on its gameplay. It was just very small, a mere +7, which is not great. And that's because it did do plenty right. There were several things that are very well done. One of the things I talk about a lot is the viscerality of combat. Now, a lot of games fail at this, but spell effects need to be cool. Guns need to feel and sound awesome. When you do a combo move in a fighting game or in a beat-em-up brawler like Spider-Man or whatever, it needs to have that viscerality. It needs to have visual and audio design to it that makes it fun to use. The game should encourage you to use its tools just by making them cool or fun or interesting or awesome or whatever, right? To varying degrees of effect, obviously. But this is something I've been talking about a lot. It really came up the first time when we were discussing one of the first FPSs we ever covered on this channel, which was actually Doom 4 specifically, which did a really good job of that. So I bring that up because this game does a really good job of that. Not so much with the guns, I'll circle back to that, but mostly with the powers. Hovering through the air and pulling forward 3 chunks of concrete and also this dude to fling at someone Mach 10, 500 feet away from you, is cool. Setting up a barrier and moving up to someone before shoving it in their face is cool. And there's a lot of effort and work done into the nitty-gritty details that I can't possibly convey to you properly without just saying, go watch the VOD. When you're hovering, or even when you're holding something with your telekinesis, latent objects kind of get pulled up into it, like you've got a little bit of a gravitational pull, and it just kind of starts just yanking them up a little bit. They eventually clatter to the ground. There's bits of dust and concrete floating around as you do it. There's a very distinct sound design, which I cannot possibly emulate without just going like the professional that I am. But you get the general idea. You can hear the air being ripped apart as you're pulling these things and then flinging them at them, and it's very viscerally satisfying. It's very fun combat. The gameplay isn't quite as engaging because, and you're probably like, wait, hold on, Lore. You just said gameplay, but you just said the combat was good. Something I've been banging on about for years now is that while gameplay is an umbrella, combat is only one of the spokes underneath that umbrella. And a lot of times people will say this game has crap gameplay, but what they mean is it has crap combat. But of course, the combat in this game isn't crap. It's very fun and enjoyable, if simple. Now, there's nothing wrong with simple combat. Not really. There is, however, a very key and critical distinction when you're going to have simple combat. You have to do this, and this is very important. Don't overdo it. Don't make the player do too much of it. Because the lack of depth and the simplicity means it will get boring quicker. Now, all combat gets boring after a while. Everyone has their own threshold, blah, 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 blah. But the point is, at a certain point or another, your player is going to get tired of the combat. And it's a dive. Their tolerance for the combat, it might go up like, oh, this is so much fun. Okay, it's the same thing. And the moment it starts going down, it plummets. And this is pretty true for most players in general. The moment that starts to downturn, it nosedives into unacceptability because they're sick of it, and then they have to do it again and again and again and again. I actually have a term for this. I call it Dragon Age 2 syndrome. Because Dragon Age 2 has very fun combat and way too much of it. This is why I made that distinction earlier between combat and gameplay, because the combat itself is not the problem. They could have done more to flesh it out more. Off the top of my head, they could have made more combo stuff. So, like, maybe you can use a certain gun with a certain power, or maybe, like, certain guns just match up. So, like, for example, the shotgun automatically shoots out chunks of your barrier at the enemy if you shoot it while you have the barrier up, or something like that. You know, you could do stuff to mix and match and make your powers and abilities coincide with each other more, rather than I use the barrier, then I drop it to shoot, then I pull up the barrier, then I drop it to shoot, right? Stuff like that could add to the complexity, but that takes time, and that takes effort, and that takes development time. And as always, any developers has to look at their time and money budget and decide where to allocate it. And this is not exactly a AAA title, and, well, to be perfectly frank, most AAA titles don't have the time and money budgets they need anyways. So, you need to be careful about what you allocate it towards. So why don't we allocate that towards nothing? You know, let's just pull back from that, and let's put it instead on the gameplay axis. And you're probably thinking, okay, what about the gameplay would make the combat better? The encounters. So the problem, the biggest problem with this game by far is that I was so sick of the encounters that by a certain point, I would just start ignoring them. And when the game would force me to fight them, I was always just this, by the time I got to that point. Everyone I talked to in chat who had played the game before had the exact same problem. Different points. Everybody hits their points at a different time in the game, as I mentioned. But this is like a 30-plus hour game. This is not a short game. So you're probably going to hit that point at one point or another. Now that I've said that, someone in the comment section is going to say, I never hit that point, which is fine. In fact, that's awesome, because that means you enjoyed the game more than I did, because I was freaking sick of it after a certain point. Fixing that is so easy. Now, the Band-Aid, the super quick and easy solution, is just to reduce the number of encounters and reduce the number of waves. Done. But if we wanted to be complex about it, we could do a couple other things. One of the biggest problems is, and I did some tests on this, the combat encounters respawn on a global timer. So all of the random trash, and it is trash, you fight that stuff based on a certain amount of time passing. I believe it's about 3 to 5 minutes, but I'm not 100% sure on that. What I mean by that is if you're in an area that's a trash area, a combat-capable area, and you kill everything there, you have about 3 to 5 minutes of roaming before they all respawn. This actually happened to me more than once. But the thing is, if you move to another area, it won't respawn there because you're still on the global timer until the timer ticks over. Then you get another trash encounter. Make sense? So, again, the Band-Aid is to move that out, but I think the better solution is to eject it entirely. Just nix it. And you're like, well, but Laura, then how are you going to level up? Well, you don't level up with trash encounters in this game. You level up by doing quests. That's what gets you ability points. That's what actually gives you points to put into your tree. The only thing you get from trash encounters is source, which is of very questionable value, and mods, which ditto. I'll talk about the loot system in just a second. It's the same problem a lot of the more recent Paper Mario RPGs have, where they throw you into many, many encounters that have no benefit. It's the same problem Pillars of Eternity 1 had. There was no benefit to doing the combat encounters, and so if you don't enjoy the combat, you feel like you're wasting your time because you are. So, you see, you already see the solutions cropping up here, right? We can remove the respawns, we could reduce the respawns, or use different methods. So one of the things I've suggested on stream is make it so that there are manually designed respawns, right? So, in other words, plot respawns. We clear out areas, and they stay cleared, right? Which ironically would be easier to keep track of than what they do, where everything respawns the moment you leave the zone. But, and then like you hit a certain point, it's like, oh my god, everything's going out of control. And then respawns, right? Higher level respawns even, in order to kind of keep things going. And then you could clear it again if you so feel like it, or just move through it, or whatever. You get the idea. Manually triggered respawns rather than just, a global timer. Another thing they could do, as I mentioned, is they could make it more valuable. So, this game uses the shotgun loot method. Now, I've talked about this many times before, but in brief, it's exactly what it sounds like. It just shoots loot at you en masse. Now, this isn't as bad as some games I could mention, looking at you, Borderlands, but if you're going to do the shotgun loot method, you need to do stuff to make that work. You need to be able to tell at a glance what you're looking at and how much you care about it. They do that, kind of, with the coloration on the mods, so you can tell which level it is. You need to have a quick and easy method to sort. You need to have a large inventory size. You need to have plenty of bank storage or some kind of inventory storage to be able to manage the large amounts of loot that's coming in. And the ability to do it pretty much on the fly. To use Diablo 3 as an example, if your inventory is full, you just channel Hearth, go to the bank, dump, go back to the thing, and inside of 10 seconds, you're right back into the action. Very little pausing. And that's assuming you don't want to actually do anything with it. You just want to dump it in the bank and move on, right? That's an option. No such thing here. A mass deconstruct would not go amiss. There is a deconstruct, and it's not super slow. That's good. It's not like this game is crap gameplay, like I kind of prefaced this whole thing with. It's not as good as it needs to be to support what they're going for. Better filters. So there are filters. Actually, no, there's a sort in the mods menu, but better filters to say, I only want to see this, or I only want to loot this. I only want these kind of things to be picked up. These are the kind of things you can do to make a shotgun system work, because then you can just loot at the player, and then they can do what they want to do, either pick it all up because they want to craft, or they pick up only things they want because that's all they care about, or not pick up anything because they don't give a damn. It puts the options into the player's hand, which I'm always in favor of. But the best option here, by far, would be the ashtray maze. Now, the ashtray maze was awesome, let's be clear. But the thing is, that should have been the whole game. Let me explain. The ashtray maze is a manually crafted, very tightly constructed encounter. That is an encounter in the traditional sense of the word. You're going through, and the level kind of changes around you, and it informs the story as well as the gameplay, so that's a nice bonus. But as stuff is happening, the level design is part of the encounter. And it was because it was so manually crafted, because it was so tightly thought out, because of the music being part of it, because of the fact that the level design was part of it, because of the fact that the encounters and what was being fought where and how, all of that made that a good encounter. That's one of the reasons why that's such an awesome moment, and why everybody praises the ashtray maze, was because they put a lot of time and effort into manually crafting an excellent encounter. You already see where I'm going with this. This is the most expensive option by far, which is why I mention it last. But I do agree with the idea that this is what the gameplay of this game should have been. Every encounter should have been like that. I don't mean the ashtray maze specifically. I mean they should have sat down and thought, okay, how do we want to make this one? Rather than another empty office arena with the same 5 types of enemies over and over, they could have thought about, okay, how do we make it so that this section is something, and we're going to fight these enemies, and this is going to do this, and this part of the wall is going to kind of go like this, and that's going to block the player off, which is going to give them a few seconds to deal with the trash before the big guy breaks through the wall and actually smashes through, and then you got to deal with that. And you get the idea. I'm not going to go down the list. There are so many dozens upon dozens of possibilities with this, especially since this game makes a big point of fact that the building is malleable, that it's moving and shifting all the time. In fact, it's a major point of the Foundation DLC. So, do more of that. Side note. This would take a ludicrous amount of time and effort and money and energy, but in a blank check scenario, one of the things I would love from something like this is have a 2-player mode, a co-op mode. Maybe going up to 4 players, but have it so that one of the players can play the building. And just picture that. You've got all the chunks of wall, and you've got probably cooldowns or a mana source or something like that, so you can't just go it all willy-nilly. And so you have to think, okay, there's enemies over there. Smash! Okay. Okay, I don't have enough mana or time or whatever to destroy those enemies, but I could throw up a barrier so the players have a moment to recoup and get these health ups, or I could spawn health ups underneath them so they could regenerate a little bit, or maybe like an energy thing or something. And there's so much you can do with that kind of sounds awesome to me. But again, that would take an insane amount of time and work, and again, would only work in a situation where the encounters were all manually crafted, as the aforementioned. Shrug. All of this boils down to an enjoyable combat system with enjoyable abilities that got so boring I just wanted to stop playing it after a certain point. I could talk about other aspects of the gameplay. There's the puzzles, which are okay. There's the platforming, which is okay. There's flying, which is awesome. But at the end of the day, most of my thoughts and comments about the gameplay revolve around that idea. So I suppose it's time to talk about the narrative. This is going to be a little more free-form than my norm. I do have several notes that I'll be referencing here. In fact, let's make sure I can read these nice and immediately here. There we go. But where to begin? So let's assume for a moment that you don't like weird stuff. You know what I mean? And do you think under those auspices that you would enjoy this game? If you played the first hour, maybe even just half an hour, you'd probably think, oh, this isn't for me, and you'd walk out. Because the intro is very, for lack of a better way to put it, weird. Here's the thing, and I thought this early on. I can only attribute this to analysis, because I've analyzed a ludicrous amount of fiction over the last 30 years, or 40 years, or how long it is at this point? 50 years? How old am I? The idea is 370 years. The idea is that after a while you get a feel for something that's just being weird for weird's sake, which I don't like. Even though there is a purpose for that kind of fiction, it's not my thing and it's never going to be. And weird with purpose. This is weird with purpose, and I could tell that right from the beginning. And I'm very grateful to say that I was right. We're still technically in the non-spoilers territory, but on the off chance you're thinking about picking up this game and my aforementioned thing didn't dissuade you, let me mention two things very much in favor of this game. First of all, it has built-in cheats. They're also good built-in cheats. It's not just like a difficulty toggle. You can change the percentage of how fast your mana regenerates. You can change the percentage of how much damage you take, up to taking no damage. And you could change how fast your ammo comes back. You can make yourself flat out invincible. You could add aim assist if you're playing on controller or just don't want to do the mouse controls or whatever. And you can have really loud bass in your background. And there's nothing I can do about that. I apologize. There's nothing I can do about that. The solution to that is to buy a house, and that's never happening. You know how housing prices are. And the final option is to be able to make it so that enemies have 1 HP. So any damage you do to them, they are dead. These are very good cheats. They're not the best cheats I've ever seen, but they were good enough that I gave 2 positives for it. They're granular, you can pick and choose what you want, and it allows you to customize your experience to your will. In fact, towards the end, what I ended up doing was I sort of made it so that enemies did half damage to me. And that's it. And that actually fixed quite a bit, because you're a little glass cannon-y. I know what you're thinking, but you had a glass cannon build. Well, no, I had a lot of HP boosters going on, and I was still just getting railed on. As I mentioned, the gameplay has some issues, but the cheats are the first thing. By the way, there's no detriment to using the cheats, as it should be, if I might be so bold. There should be zero detriment to turning on cheats or turning down difficulty, because if we're being honest, cheats and difficulty really are just 2 flavors of the same concept, customizing how your gameplay experience is going to go, right? It's a form of options under the options umbrella. So that makes sense. I'm with that. Obviously, that doesn't apply in multiplayer, just to be complete about that. But the other thing I want to tell you to try and sell you on playing this game, I didn't forget about it, is that this game is not weird for weird's sake. It's not nonsense. It's not loopy-loo. It's not... It is very tightly written, very internally consistent, and virtually everything that happened in it happened for a reason, and a reason we could deduce relatively quickly. There are a few questions left at the end of the game, but only a few, and that's good. The game actually bothers to explain pretty much everything that was going on. And for a game like this, which is built around this kind of pseudo-paranormal mystery thing, in my opinion, that has to happen. Well, let me walk that back. For the style of game they were going for, that has to happen. You know, if you're doing a paranormal thing where just weird things happen because weird, usually what you're going through is a straight horror tint. And that's fine. But that's not this. This is not a horror game. This, Sierra Mike calls this a cosmic horror without the horror, which is a nice way to put it. This is a paranormal game, but you are a bureau. You are a group of people who have worked for decades in order to try and catalog, categorize, organize, protect, and take care of these kind of things and ensure that they don't cause damages or harm to the greater public as a whole. That kind of game, you need to have those explanations. You need to have those answers, and you can't pull an X-Files. No spoilers, but you know what I mean. So, by the end of the game, I really only had a couple of questions. And even some of those were answered by the DLCs. I should probably mention that the Foundation DLC was not my thing, but the AWE one was much better. But I mentioned spoilers. Let's go ahead and jump into that, shall we? So, we're officially past spoilers now, just to be clear about this. First of all, This is by Remedy. I don't think I mentioned that, actually. Fun fact, completely by accident, I've played almost all of their games. There's only 2 of their games I haven't played now, which is Alan Wake, ironically, and their first one, which is some racing game. I don't even remember the name of it. It was way back in the 90s. That's it. I've played all of their other games, Quantum Break and just all that. It's surprising and not really intentional. I will be playing Alan Wake 2 when that comes out, most likely, assuming everyone funds it. So far, there's not a lot of interest in it, but we don't even have a release window, so that's whatever. But I bring that up because they like to contrast their characters. So let's look at Alan from Alan Wake, and let's look at Jesse. Now, at first glance, you might think they're completely different, but I disagree with that. So why are they so different? Well, because Jesse is a superpowered death machine who can mow down people by the dozens. Perfect for defeating the darkness, you might say. Whereas Alan is a completely ordinary guy who has no special powers or anything, really, other than the fact that, he's got his typewriter, his creativity, and a certain connection, which we're not going to go into right now, because I'm not trying not to spoil Alan Wake, but, what can I do? The reason I bring that up, though, is because to me they're both very similar. And in fact, I think their similarity is exactly why Jesse was perfect for this role. What's one of the first things Jesse says? A janitor, huh? I'd be more comfortable with that as a director. Paraphrased. Jesse is an everyman. Or woman. Every woman? Every person? Jesse is relatable, is actually the important word here. Jesse is the kind of person that just about any person can see and say, yeah, okay. And you just kind of have that relatability. And she's got a sort of, I need to keep going attitude that works rather well for her. But never does she let it go to her head, and never does she think, I am the director, and I am Director Trench, and I am in charge, and how dare you, and I am beyond you. She might eventually, we'll see, in Alan Wake 2, but the point is that what we have in her is a normal, ordinary person who is handed superpowers, and it works really well. This is a story that a lot of other stories have tried to pull off. The ordinary person being given to. It is, if we're being honest, the core precept of the Spider-Man tale. That ordinary Peter Parker is given this tremendous power and does great things with it. Why? Because he's so relatable. Because he's so grounded. And because he is so ordinary. He has that sort of both psychological and mental anchor to normal life, to care about that one random person down the street, to care about the consequences of their actions. And that is exactly what Jessie is. She very much wants to do good, but she wants to do good properly. So yes, I know the irony of this since the latest Spider-Man movie just came out yesterday from this telling. I haven't seen it yet, by the way, no spoilers. Spoilers will be banned. But it is very much that Jessie is a Spider-Man archetype, and I do think that works very, very much for her, which is also how she works very well as a protagonist in this work in general. It's also worth noting that there's some other similarities here. Let's move on to... I'm looking at my notes here. Where do I want to go next? One of the things that this game does, interestingly, is it has a couple of other things. There's 2 big ones that really jump out at me. There's several. There's like a dozen. But there's 2 big ones I want to point your attention to. One of them is the clog, and one of them is the mold. Now, the clog shows up several times, actually. The mold shows up a lot more than several times. Both of them are extra-dimensional invaders, deliberately or otherwise, which have been causing issues within the oldest house, and as a direct consequence of that, need to be dealt with. You might think, why are those things here in a story that's all about defeating the hiss, all about trying to push back against this actively invading force, which is so obviously malevolent and so obviously overt? Why even have the mold? Why even have the clog? Because this is a Tuesday. The important relevance here is that this is ordinary. It's something that they touch on in the Men in Black series, which this series parallels in several ways, mostly superficial, nothing in-depth, because Men in Black is far more about wacky slapstick, whereas this is far more about actually analyzing the consequences of such an existence. But the fact remains, right? This is just your job now, is dealing with this kind of stuff on a regular basis. Yes, the hiss are invading and that sucks, but we also have to deal with this because it's a Tuesday. And that's one of the things they get across very well, is that atmosphere and tone of constantly trying to deal with this kind of nonsense in a very orderly and functional and structured fashion, which may or may not involve picking something up and throwing it at something very quickly. I suppose I'll go ahead and jump into the obvious thing. Let's talk about Ahti. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. I've been told the way they pronounce it in the game, which is Ahti, is not correct. So I'm trying to correct myself. So forgive me if I screw up. Shrug. There's only so much I can do about this. I'm terrible and awful. Ahti is... So we talked about this extensively on stream. And as always, these ruminations are effectively a summarization of the stream. So let me try to summarize the 20-minute conversation here. There's an archetype. There's actually 3 archetypes in fiction. It's the knows more than they lets on. Usually there's hints or snippets of the fact that they know more, that they understand the concepts and what's really happening in the world or the setting or whatever, right? The thing is, they tend to lean on one of 3 axes. Now, note this has had nothing to do with their alignment, whether good, evil, or in between. This is all about how they are in service of the plot. Positive, neutral, negative. The positive is actively adding to the narrative, to us, the perceiver, as well as to the main character, trying to give them tidbits so that they can do their job. The neutral doesn't seem to give a damn, and the negative is someone who is actively trying to keep people in the dark about things, and is usually trying to further their own agenda, which probably is in opposition to the protagonist, right? Now, I'm saying this kind of vaguely because this applies kind of universally, but Silence over in Horizon Zero Dawn is a perfect example of a negative of this archetype. Actually, so is Aloy, but let's not get into that for the moment. The Q over in Star Trek, John Delancey Q, it depends on how he's written, but is generally more of the neutral to positive side. Guinan, to use Star Trek Next Generation as an example, is very much on the positive axis of that, and so forth and so on. If you were to sit down and think, you could probably come up with plenty of examples of this particular archetype. Lord knows we did on stream. The point of this archetype, though, is that it has a lot of appeal to the writer in particular, because it allows the writer, who knows all this stuff, to leak snippets out to the reader, or to the player, or to the viewer, or whatever, pretty much however they want to, in however a vague a manner they want to. It's more or less a direct pipeline from author to us. And that's one of the appeals for them. And of course, it can work for us because usually more effort and work is put into the crafting of these roles so that they are either well presented, well designed, or well written enough that they're enjoyable. See every example I just gave for an example of that. This, of course, leads me to Ahti, who is very much on the positive axis of things. He is definitely trying to add things to both Jesse and to us, the perceiver, in order to try and make it so that we can learn more about the world going on around us. He doesn't... At the same time, he does it in his own way, and he does it in his own language. I don't mean literally Finnish or whatever. I mean, like, he uses his own sentence structure in a very particular manner. God, that's distracting. So he wants to... I wonder if I just put in earplugs. Note to self, buy earplugs. He very much gives away a lot, and it's very clear that he is exactly what he should be. The janitor. We talked a lot about what that means on stream, and I'm not going to summarize literally hours of discussion here. Well, okay, I'm going to try to. What is a janitor? What is a good janitor? A good janitor is someone who knows that building inside and out. They have a key to every door. They have access to every person. They know every person. They know what's going on in that place, whether they have authority or access to or not, because they're a good janitor. It is their job to clean up the mess. It is no surprise that Ahti is such a prevalent character despite having so little screen time, considering that we are, let's be blunt, playing a janitor in this very same game. One of the things that Trench says several times, is he talks about what he believes the role of the director to be. This is especially in contrast to Northmore, who, well, at least Northmore did help keep the lights on. Jessie, by contrast, approaches the directorial job as a janitor. It is her job to help clean up things, to know everyone, and to know the building inside and out. And this approach helps her tremendously. I am admittedly a little bit biased here because I have spent literally years of my own real life as a janitor, and I clean even to this very day, but just personally and for my family and friends. But the fact of the matter is, I do legitimately believe that approaching certain leadership roles with the mentality of a janitor, again, a good janitor, would be a good thing. And Jessie here in this very game shows why I think that. But she couldn't have done that if someone wasn't there to help guide her and get her to the position. And, well, that's Ahti, right? But I haven't really discussed who and what he is. Now, I'll admit I only have one theory. I think he has his own agenda, of course, but I think it's relatively benign and benevolent since right? Positive aligned. But more to the point, we kept using the analogy of that there's a board game going on throughout the universe, and I think, I think that Ahti is either an observer of the board game, and therefore doesn't have a stake in it, he's just kind of messing with it, or he is another player at the table, and there's multiple players at said table. We do know that there is a bare minimum of 4 players at the table. There's the hiss, there's the darkness, there's the board, and there's former. There are others that are debatable, but those 4 are pretty codified. And I'm curious, I'm going to pause here for a moment and ask, do you think Ahti is actually sitting at the board, or do you think he's simply watching from a distance? Either way, oh yeah, by the way, Igor from Persona, that's another example of this archetype while we're on the subject. Let's move on to talk about Darling really quick. So first of all, Darling is awesome. Actually, let's not talk about Darling. I don't like Darling. Darling sucks. Let's talk about the board, because I have the least thoughts about the board and former, but this does kind of feel like a good segue, doesn't it? The board and former are both obviously at the table, trying to play the game. What are they after, though? Well, based on subjective evidence, what we can probably deduce is that the board is interested in things happening in a certain manner that they control, and former is interested in doing its own thing. And that's about all we can really deduce from that conclusively. All the rest is speculation, and since that's kind of the nature of these ruminations, I will go ahead and share my speculation with you. I think the board are treating Earth and the world and humanity and all that as livestock. That they're not quite literally feeding off us so much as they are metaphorically feeding off of what we offer them. That the very nature of the Bureau and their connection to us and what the FBC does feeds them either nourishment or power or political estrangement or money, whatever money can be to beings such as them, something, right? And so they are benefited from their interactions with us. Hence why they get so involved with us, because you want to take care of your livestock. Note that this does not make them antagonistic. Not really. It doesn't even make them villainous. After all, they do care about us, and they do intervene to help us in multiple affairs. They want to. Again, you don't want something bad to happen to your livestock. But that brings me to former. What the heck is former after? The one thing we can conclusively say is that former is trying to create altered things and trying to interfere with what the board is doing. And the two are very much in disagreement on certain things. This, I don't have any real evidence of this other than the game. But what I think is that former is trying to connect the two. Now, there's no real life analogy here, except for that of a child. I think that former wants to lift us up to the level that the board and former are at. To connect with the astral plane and the physical plane to such an extent that the two are functionally the same, and that we can operate and function on this new merged plane along with former. Now, you might think, well, what does that have to do with why the former is against the board? Well, you don't keep people as livestock, right? You keep lower beings, that is to say animals, as livestock. If animals were brought up to the level of sentience and sapience of humans, and the full ability to communicate and interact with us on the level that we do of the society and civilization we do, we have a problem then, right? And you see the point, and why the two would be in contention one with another. That's my thoughts on those. I'm looking forward to hearing other people's theories. I imagine I'm getting a lot of theories in the comments section. But let's talk about the big one. So I mentioned Darling. Darling is awesome. There's an old concept called the Cassandra truth, but the problem is that literally vibrating? I think, oh my God, it is. That's ridiculous. The Cassandra truth, it refers to someone who knows the truth and nobody listens to them, right? Which I hate in fiction. But there's actually a slightly different trope, which I don't have a term for. I'm going to just call it the Darlingism. So the Darlingism is when you know the truth and there's not really anything you can do about it. So what do? A meteor is going to strike the Earth in 10 days. What do? You have no power to stop it. Now, what Darling did, and this is interesting, is he did everything in his power to mitigate. To use the meteor analogy, he built shelters. He distributed food and medical supplies. He made sure that there would be people in positions so that there would be people who could endure and survive. But I bring this up specifically because one of the specific questions I was asked is, do I think, Darling went insane from the truth? No. I think Darling adapted to the truth as is our wont. He looked at the truth and said, oh, okay. And the very next question he asked was, what can I do about that? A very human reaction, I might add. And he did. He tapped into Hedron, the resonance that was being pumped through / by the Hedron, in order to spread it out to everyone who was wearing their the active Hedron, AHEs, I forget what the acronym is, the damn vests that they wear, so that people would be protected by these things, and there would be the possibility that they would be able to avoid his control, and this wouldn't happen. Let's be clear, if Darling hadn't done all that he did, this would have been game from word one. The moment Trench actually opened the door and pulled open the slide projector, that was kind of the end of that. It's a good segue to talk about Trench. Trench is ultimately a very pitiable figure. In fact, I would go so far as to say that he is a tragic figure. He is someone who obviously did care about doing a job, but was always a little bit of a control freak, just a little bit paranoid, which are useful tools when you're working in a federal agency of this level, to be honest. It's just you need to not let them get distended to the point where that becomes all you're thinking about is how many... there's a memo we read in game where he actually starts threatening someone because how dare you, I know what I'm doing, blah, 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 you're a traitor. And it's like, okay, rein it in a bit, Trench. But it makes perfect sense that that would happen. After all, his daughter died and his wife left him. And he dedicated himself to the job. And that was his flaw. A concept that's brought up in a few bits of fiction, and one I like a lot, actually, because I think this actually applies in real life, too. Not that I think there's ghosts or supernatural, whatever in real life. What I mean by that is certain levels of stress, aspects of normalcy help us to deal with that. Now, what those aspects are, that can vary and change depending on the individual and the perspective, but a dog, having a puppy at home, or having a child, or having a wife, or having friends, or going to see the game every Thursday. The mundanity of it, I usually use the word mundane as an insult, but it isn't necessarily one. The normalcy of it, the utter mundanity of just sitting back and watching the latest Formula One race, or deciding to hit up the theater to watch a movie with your friends or whatever. These kind of things help to ground us in real life. People who undergo very stressful jobs, and again, part of my family's from the military and part of my family's from the medical industry. So these people, what they've done to me, and I've talked to them about this, they have these anchors that help them to be sane, to help them to cope, to process, a sponge by which the poison can go through before it hits the rest of them. It's a terrible analogy, but I stand by it. Trench lost that. Lost his daughter, lost his wife, dedicated himself to the job, went nuts. And that makes perfect sense. There's no malice there. Just degeneration. It took him years, like 10 years, something like that, before he finally gave in to the hiss, even though he had that worm in his ear from the very beginning. He fought it for a while. Now, what's really interesting is this throws into beautiful contrast Jessie, who is very grounded, not only by her desire to see her brother, but by the fact that she's had Polaris with her ever since. So the supernatural has become the mundane for her. And again, janitor. And so she already has that grounded mentality, and she already has that psychology that allows her to cope with these things and to not go, instead of trying to, control everything. Control is obviously a very predominant theme in this game, but what's interesting is it's shown from both a negative, positive, and everything in between light. We see different people looking at their situation and how they try to control it, and how it worked and how it didn't. Trench tried to squeeze. That didn't work out. Northmore tried to tap directly into. That didn't work out. Jessie tries to maneuver around while simultaneously picking up the pieces. That worked out a lot better. And there's other examples I'm not going to go into right now. I could honestly probably just sit here and talk for all. It's a 30-hour game. What do you want from me? Go watch the VOD. We talk about this a lot. But I have one last thing I wanted to talk about, and that's the thing I've been suspiciously not really bringing up yet. The hiss and polaris, or hedron, if you prefer. Now, I actually have half the notes on my page are about them, so make of that what you will. One of the more interesting things... So let me go ahead and give my big theory right up front. I don't think the hiss are sentient or sapient. I think the polaris is, but I don't think the hiss are. Now, that's not just because of the fact that they were probably written into existence by Alan Wake, but also because of the fact of the nature of how they operate and what they do. The hiss remind me, and I don't mean to call this into question, but I mean, there's a lot of similarities. The hiss remind me of cordyceps in real life, but also in, The Last of Us. The cordyceps don't have sentience. They don't have sapience. They don't have an agenda or a goal. They're simply doing what they do because that's what they do, because that's what they are. And that is very much what the hiss are to me. They're just a violently invasive parasitic species. Now, what they are is a resident species, which makes so much sense to me that I worry about my own sanity. No, think about it. We of course are comprised of all sorts of stuff, but imagine if all that we were was nothing more than a frequency, but that frequency contained all that we are, and maybe we're made of multiple frequencies, or maybe there's a pattern to it. I mean, there's this freaking poem, which was written by Wake, thanks for that, buddy, which they repeat, the bodies repeat, and it's very much made clear that what's happening is that is an amplifier for their frequency. That is the closest that human English speech, or whatever language you're playing this in, can equate to what their pattern is, because that's what a frequency is, a specific pattern. And so they're trying to artificially boost that in the same way that they're trying to put seeds or spores into a host. So I don't think the hiss are sentient or sapient. But what's interesting to me most is the hiss are so much in contrast to Polaris. I've recently been playing a bit of Guild Wars 2. We actually just finished getting our legendary necks, if you haven't know what that means. And I'm reminded of Primordus and Jormag. Don't worry, I'll give you the details, or I'll give you an overview if you're not sure. Primordus is effectively not sentient or sapient. He is at best a low-level beast, like not even at dog level, much, much lower than dog level intelligence, like a bug level of intelligence. There's barely any intellect there at all. Jormag, by contrast, is someone who is very much a manipulator and a thinker, and someone who is entirely, almost predominantly, set within the mental domain. And you can see the contrast there and why I bring it up in this situation. In this case, the Primordus of control would be the hiss, and the Jormag would actually be the board. But I purport the idea that the board and its rough communication with us is more a consequence of experience and... No, I'm just going to stick with that. Experience rather than anything else. I think Polaris could do full communication if it were capable or wanting to do so. I suppose I should say she, because Jesse consistently refers to her as a she. But let's bring this back to hiss versus... So obviously, what's the big contrast between Polaris and the hiss? Is it the colors? Is it the fact that the hiss is obviously a smear of fungus, whereas Polaris is the fractal of light? No. All that stuff's wonderful visual contrast, and they do some wonderful stuff with it. But no, the big contrast for me is actually something I'm going to pull from Elder Scrolls. The hiss want to interfere as much as possible, whereas Polaris seems to more want to prevent interference. Polaris is helping, obviously. Duh. But at the same time, most of that help is preventing interference, preventing other alien beings from using or abusing us to their own benefit. This is true regardless of whether it's the hiss. This is true for every one of the things that we encounter throughout the course of this game. I don't want to pull in a full prime directive kind of a thing, but it feels like Polaris very much wants to try and ensure that we have the ability to be who we are without these kinds of attacks. A defense force. Either because it's assigned such a concept, the concept of a police, if you will, or another way I would put this would be this could be effectively a superhero of the resonance beings, something that goes out of its way, her way, in order to try and defend those that have no defense. Because again, if not for Polaris, the moment Trench opened that door, we would be doomed to that parasitic invasion. And we weren't. But that's another thing. One of the interesting things that the two do is Polaris focuses all of her power and imbuement and modifications onto a single being, us, right? Oh, sure, there's the resonance, which is protecting everyone else from the hiss, but all of the modifications, all of the empowerment, for lack of a better way to put it, is put onto us. There's actually a term for this. It's basically quality versus quantity, but there's another term for this I can't remember off the top of my head, forgive me. But it's the idea of, do you focus all your things onto one super unit and have a Superman running around, or do you have 50 low-level mooks? And, of course, what does the hiss do? Oh, sure, the hiss empowers its people, and that works to varying levels of degree, but you get the point. In fact, if not for Dylan, the hiss would have no really particularly powerful beings. And it's worth noting, Dylan never really does anything in the game, which is interesting in its own right, other than serving as yet another magnifier for the hiss, so that sucks. But the other thing that really struck me here is the nature of how they interact with us is really different. And it makes me wonder if we're dealing with different types of resonating beings. Because on the one hand, what the hiss does is a magnifier, right? Obviously, it takes your training and your shooting and all that from a gameplay perspective. But what I mean by that is it takes your mental, your traits, your thoughts, your concepts, your emotions, and it distends and magnifies them so that Trench becomes super paranoid and a control freak, or Dylan becomes extremely resentful and gets lost within his own head. And there are other examples, but you get the idea, right? The hiss makes these people go, where? Because it magnifies what they are. But Polaris fortifies. It keeps you what you are. And it makes sure that what you are doesn't change, that you are, no matter what happens and no matter what goes into you, no matter what blows, both emotional and mental, you are a janitor. At the end of the day, I enjoyed this game quite a lot. Its golden number was in the 80s, which for anybody who knows means this is at the very least a great game, and I stand by that. The gameplay, I wish I'd cheated earlier so I could have enjoyed it more, but nevertheless, there's still some really good hints there. I am legitimately excited about someday covering Alan Wake as well as Alan Wake 2. Very much looking forward to your thoughts and comments and theorycraft and telling me how incredibly wrong I am about everything. And otherwise, I will see you all next time.